always believed that everyone has a story and that everyone's story has value. I'm Joanna Peña-Bickley, the host of Designed By, a new Designed By Us documentary series that recognizes the changemakers, imagineers, and inventors in STEAMed science, technology, engineering, arts, math, and design. As I have traveled the globe and collaborated with some of the world's leading scientists, artists, and mathematicians, I know that daring to design the future today all begins with a vision and a narrative of a hopeful future. I invite you to join us on a journey of discovery, finding the voices and magic makers, changing the very shape of our future. Hello and welcome to another episode of Designed By. I couldn't be more excited to have today's guest, who is Adrian Franks. Our relationship dates back to many, many years. And so the excitement around this is actually quite personal, because when you meet someone with Adrian's talents and you get the opportunity to play in a sandbox with them, what you realize is that it is an opportunity to make magic every single time. So Adrian, I want to start off with something that, often we don't talk about in our work lives, but we certainly, I feel like we've been on a journey together, but I feel like I've joined you at a midpoint in the journey. Mm-hmm. So I want to go back to the beginning of your journey and start with, where are you from?
Where I'm from? I'm born and raised in Atlanta, Georgia. Bicentennial kid from 1976. Basically, I got 5 siblings. Unofficially, I got 5 siblings. Officially, I got 4 siblings. My oldest sister had a kid very young. So we more or less, my parents raised 6 kids onto themselves, right? But I grew up in a time in Atlanta when it was a transitional city. It went from being, a small town, kind of formerly called Terminus or Marthasville, to trying to become a major town, right? So Atlanta had recently, during that time, had a transition of, I wouldn't say power, but just a overall culture shift. We had the first black mayor with Maynard Jackson, first black chief of police. The actual airport was being built. Atlanta was trying to become like this city of commerce for the South. And, it was just a funny time in the A, what we call Atlanta, obviously the A. How things were just transitioning from being like this small, sleepy town capital of, I guess, Georgia to trying to become like a major business outlet. So yeah, Atlanta is my, that's where I'm from, born and bred.
Atlanta has such an interesting time because, I think you've touched on something that has been of interest to me, which is this time of the transformation of Atlanta, right? This transformation you talked about of it being a small city to an economic engine. And for what it's worth, it had that history of being an economic engine in the South. Cotton was, if we think at history, cotton, the cotton trade, the cotton industry.
Cotton, tobacco.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So this transformation in the 80s, that it went through, it was also at this very tumultuous time. And it would say like late 70s and early 80s, tumultuous time in the country. What do you remember from that when you were a kid?
Well, here's the funny thing, right? So Atlanta's coming out of that civil rights era of the 60s and the 70s, right? And, Martin Luther King obviously born there and, unfortunately, killed, assassinated, really just 8 years prior to me being born, right? So if you just look at it like that, Atlanta was moving into, I guess, overall, it's trying to become a major city, but the things that it was going through at the time was, Jimmy Carter, his presidency was coming to an end. Ronald Reagan was coming in. So you got the beginning of what they call Reaganomics started, right? So that entailed a whole bunch of like busting up of unions and this idea of, white flight of a lot of people leaving these urban outlets in the 70s, going into the 80s to go out to the suburbs, which left a lot of the, places like Atlanta in town just kind of, without like financial resources or taxpayer base or whatever. So you start seeing a bunch of things happening, like crime ticking up. You start seeing schools actually, becoming like places where kids are just not getting the best quality education. In the case of Atlanta specifically, you had the Atlanta missing and child murders, when a bunch of kids just started randomly coming up missing, and they were being found, obviously murdered. And yeah, it was just a really crazy time back then. But the things that stuck out to me the most was a lot of the visual arts around the things of the moment, right? Especially around with the missing missing child murders. I used to see these big murals throughout the city of some of the kids that came up missing. And that actually inspired a lot of the work I do now. So it's weird how, some of the things you may see as a child, it actually would find its way into the work that you do as an adult.
Let's dive into that because, what's really interesting about that, and I think scary, I was a kid growing up in San Antonio, Texas, and I remember hearing about the missing children of Atlanta. And I think now that we revisit it, that hindsight that we have into those cases, it was the first time I think the national spotlight was put on Atlanta in this time of transformation. But it was also, that transformation was both a transformation of artistry, music, to your point around, the arts of the Black community.
Yeah.
What do you remember from that? You talked about the murals.
Yeah, I mean, those murals was created by this artist. I think he's from like Alabama. I can't remember his name exactly. I just remember the impact of those murals. It was like, it had these beautiful, it was only two colors, like almost, I wouldn't say duotone, but it was more like posterized effect, right? Which is like light color for the background. The foreground is like a dark color, which was like a brown. And the back color was like a tan color. And they would have these big blocky letters, which would be like, always watching, or never forget, or we always love you. And it was like imagery of some of these different kids. And I think that actually inspired not just me, but a lot of different people overall to just be mindful of keep an eye on your kids, right? And just always trying to make sure that you knew where your kid was. Like, the idea of you should be home by the time the lights turn on outside was like real, because who knew what was going to happen, if you was going to come up missing or not, or if your friends going to come up missing. And that more or less went on culturally long after they locked up Wayne Williams, which he was accused of, killing only two people, and they weren't even kids. And the rest of those cases was actually dumped onto him. So he was never actually charged with killing all those kids. He was actually charged with killing the two adults. And they just decided to close the case. And I just felt like at the time, politics took precedence over, trying to find a real murderer, per se. And it might have been multiple people committing these crimes. But the arts that came out of that, you had like a lot of things going on with the visual artists there. Definitely a lot of things with the musicians, because a lot of musical artists started moving to Atlanta. So even after through all that crazy turmoil, Atlanta still was this place where it was aspirational for Black people. Partly because you got the AU Center there. You got the various 4 colleges, which obviously had a big art scene and a lot of things about commerce and business and just overall higher academics located in the city. So Morris Brown, Morehouse College, Atlanta University, which used to be Clark Atlanta University, which is currently Clark Atlanta University. You got Spelman. You had those 4 HBCUs in one location, all in one city. So that draw a lot of people. And then next thing you know, Atlanta is bidding for the Olympics, and it becomes this big international city. So that alone brought more artists to the city, and specifically more designers to Atlanta because of the Olympics. So yeah, just to see how the city went from being the sleepy town in the 70s to like a major player on the world stage by the time the early 90s rolled around in 1996. You're now saying within 20 years, it changed multiple times, but it became something different like every, 5 years or so. And I would say that the arts and the music and this, even like design came out of a place of like turmoil,
It is interesting to me that so often so much of uh, our art today or the things that we make today can link back to where we came from. In Spanish,
Mm-hmm.
it's something. In Spanish, there's a term called mi tierra. Mi tierra is the land from which you derive. And what's interesting to me about Atlanta is that it is the mix of the arts and design. So for that, when did you know that you were an artist? When did you have that feeling that you went, I'm an artist, I'm a designer?
Well, the artist thing came first. So, and I think that's probably the one thing that most kids are when they come out, right? They're just free form. They're just open to being expressive and being creative. Most kids, I can almost say just about every kid. And then at some point, that either sticks with them or they, choose to do something else. I think for me, I just stuck with it. So, obviously coming out painting and drawing and coloring like every other kid. But it wasn't until I decided that I was going to intentionally write my name on my mom's wall, tracing my hand and putting my name in my hand that I said that I am this. And that was roughly probably about the age of like 8, between 7 and 8. And yeah, from that moment on, I said, I want to be an artist, and it's funny because prior to that, I used to be all into like, oh man, I like science. I want to be a scientist. But I think the moment I decided to actually express myself creatively by drawing on my mom's and pop's wall, putting my name on it, that was, I feel, was a transformative moment that I, as Adrian Ali Franks, decided that I want to be this. And I pursued it ever since. And it seemed that my parents were pretty supportive of it. Even my dad told my mom, well, I mean, that's not reprimanding for doing this. He might be an artist, right? And sure enough, I took a big liking to the arts, partly because it runs in my family. My grandparents were entertainers. They used to travel and entertain with like Louis Armstrong and Fred Astaire and Little Richard. Little Richard was ironically a friend of the family. So the creative side of me is, it's not just for me. It definitely comes from my mom's side of the family, just as entertainers and artists. A lot of the people on that side of the family were visual artists too. It turns out that my great uncle George, this guy could draw with both his hands, just like my cousin Sonny, right? So that side of the family just had the creative arts in it. But out of my mom's flock of kids, I'm the only one that more or less really took to it like wholeheartedly. And mind you, my siblings, all of those guys played in the band, was in the drama club. They were just into it. But I think I just decided that I professionally want to be this at like the age of 7 or 8.
It's fantastic. That's
Yeah.
a fantastic story because I think that it is generational. There's something to the artistry and what we do is something that is generational. Often we don't think about it that way. We think that we have this choice, but it is what it's inside of us. Sometimes it's what makes us tick.
It is. And it's funny because growing up in Atlanta, we got this place called Underground Atlanta. It's been many different, it's like almost like an underground mall, if you want to say that, right? It was like a hangout with my parents when they was in their 20s, and it became like a mall during the, Olympics. But prior to that, I used to go down to Underground Atlanta and watch these guys do these caricatures with the airbrush like all day. And they would paint these portraits. And I would just sit there for hours and watch those guys just do caricatures of people with an airbrush. So that inspired me. I also used to go to the flea market around the corner from Underground Atlanta and watch guys from like New York who used to airbrush on like the overalls and the t-shirts and stuff like that. And I would watch those guys for hours do the same type of airbrushing, but it was different, right? One was more about portraits and caricatures, and another one was about like urban style of graffiti and stuff like that. And I totally got influenced by watching both of those perspectives, all within like a 2-block radius of each other in downtown Atlanta. And yeah, that was like early 90s, right? Late 80s, early 90s. And I was just totally inspired by all of that. And, it's funny how that went on and inspired me to become, I'm more than just an artist. I can be an illustrator or like a designer, right? And that was like the age of like 12, you know? And yeah, my parents got me books on that stuff. I even took like kind of summer classes at AIU around like design and even the Art Institute of Atlanta at the time about printmaking and stuff. So yeah, it started at a very young age. And I definitely say it was with support of my parents.
What are some of the early creations that you are most proud of? Because I always look at the work that think about it this way, and I look back at my work and some of retrospectively go, wow, oh, what was I thinking? Or wow,
Yeah.
that has held its idea. The idea has been timeless. Tell me about some of that early work for you. What are those? What was driving your creation there?
I think a lot of the motivation behind my creativity at the time was, obviously drawing comic books. Like comic books is, synonymous with like most people in their early creative development. But for me, it was like me drawing not just the characters. I was trying to draw the typography in the comic books, like a lot of the actual typography on the cover, right? So I wanted to actually emulate that. So me drawing the characters is one thing, but actually drawing like the logo of like Marvel or Batman and all of those things, that was purely what I was mostly drawn to, more so than the character themselves, right? Because I noticed that each one of the characters had their own kind of, branding. At the time, I didn't know that what it was called, but I knew it was called a logo. But I didn't know that that logo was part of a brand system that you can use to identify this character within a larger brand, right? So I was more drawn to that. And, definitely looking at certain aspects of like how I would use my creativity in the community to do things for people. Like, I create logos for them or I design t-shirts for them. Like I did my class t-shirt, my seventh grade class t-shirt, for like our field day activities. And I went on to do the same thing in high school, like designing all the band t-shirts and stuff like that. And just doing different, I guess, commercial arts for the different organizations at school. So it was kind of like that would inspire me to do the same thing for companies later on in my life as a creative, right? Just coming up with different design solutions for different departments in the same organization. So kind of got started doing that really early in high school. And this is long before I even had a Mac. You're doing it all by hand, right? Or airbrushing.
Oh, that's fantastic. So talk to me about the transformation from going from making those creations, those posters, those advertisements. I mean, I think of it as equivalent of early ads. We may not have called it that, but that's what it was,
Yeah.
right? To turning into and that transformation that you've gone on to become a multi-hyphenate artist and designer.
Well, let's see. If I'm thinking about the transformation, that's a tricky one because I don't know what was the actual final tipping point to say that I'm a designer. I do know that my mom got me these catalogs about like design school and if you could be an illustrator, you can also potentially be a graphic designer. So I do remember that. I think that transformation like officially happened in like my 10th, 11th grade year in high school. This is when I started taking classes at this part of the DeKalb County school system had a it was more or less a vocation school for kids who want to take extra courses in vocation kind of skills, right? OEC was the name of it. It's called Occupational Educational Center. And you would go there for half of the day, right? So if you had like extra, classes that was just open, you would go there for like a couple hours a day and you would take on different types of skills, right? Some people take automotive, some people take home economics. But ironically, they had a visual communications class, right? So I took that for, 2 years in my 11th and 12th grade year. And basically for 3 hours out the day, I would go there and learn graphic design. My first design program I learned was Quark Express and Photoshop. And Quark Express was really, really rigid back then, but it was one of the few desktop publishing solutions. You're not talking like 1993, 92, 93 in terms of learning how to be a designer using a Mac on a computer. And that was my first introduction into taking my creative passion and artistic passion and turning into more something that's more commercial and learn the skills of how to measure things, how to use a grid, how to lay out, some type of, print make layout, or how to airbrush or scan it in and drop in an image, or even using stock photography. Back then it was all on CDs, or you had to order it from the stock house. But yeah, I was learning all that at the OEC classes. And I would say that was definitely the beginning of a tipping point from going from being like, oh, this is something kind of cool that I'm good at, or that I take a big interest into, like, no, this is like how you do it. So yeah, that's like 1992, 93.
What I love about that is that you're going through this evolution of the technologies that you use to craft your art. Do you remember some of the body of work that you worked on during that period of time?
Yeah, our instructor had us to work on logos for the school again, but it was less hand drawn and more, you know, produced in a digital manner, like using Adobe Illustrator and the pen tool, right, and then using the layout, the font tool with an Illustrator. Definitely learning how to do some packaging design. Definitely learning how to airbrush like better, like not just the stuff that I saw at Underground or at the flea markets, but actually learning the technique of color theory and layering and using mask, and definitely learning how to use the airbrush not just as an artistic tool, but also as a photo retouching tool, because you can use it to retouch photos before you scan them, right? Also learning a little bit about the darkroom, because this is prior to any digital camera on a phone, or even like some of the crappy digital cameras that came out in the late 90s or early 2000s. Yeah, we was learning how to shoot things on film, develop the film and scan it and drop it in layout, learning how to produce a mechanical, or learning how to use Crescent illustration board, just for layout purpose, or like Ruby lifts, and, laying out topography with, or using topography that's ordered like on a sheet, and you use it with the little rub tool to kind of rub your topography into a layout. So we learned a lot of the hand way of laying out. And we also learned, the digital manners of learning these like design techniques just back then. But it's funny, like, that was all print oriented. And around about the same time, obviously, it's this thing called the internet that was bubbling up, that not even my instructors knew what that was, but they knew that it was going to change design going forward, but they really couldn't teach on it. So it wasn't until years later, after I got out of school completely, that I was able to even dive deep into learning how to design for what they call the web back then, So that's like 1996, 97, before I even got to like designing for the web. There was no courses on it. You literally had to take a lot of print terminology, like, below the fold and stuff like that, and even apply it to online. And yeah, we were some of the early designers back then, learning how to design for this new frontier that nobody knew where it was going to go.
It's an interesting thing, because I remember that. I remember writing articles about, how we had taken print and tried to apply its principles of print, and everything that you were learned online. It was like this translation. But the people that were really successful on the internet were using the internet as a new, really a new palette, or a new canvas, a new better. Let me re-say that. So, it's really interesting that that you say that, because I do remember writing articles about how we shouldn't be paying attention to the fold, because what I was seeing at the time was this transformation of folks that were from print going into and applying the same print principles into the internet space. But the people who were super successful were actually using the internet as a new canvas.
Yeah, they were. I agree. I 100% agree. Like the guys that I saw that really inspired me and a couple of my friends that really used the internet like as this new playground for like innovation, with this group of designers out of New York called Kyokin. this guy named Joshua Davis, who was a programmer at the time, he was part of those guys, right? One of the guys' name is Ken, and I forgot the other partner name, but they started this whole group of design collective called Kyokin, and it's the word from the Street Fighter game. So they basically united over the love of the game Street Fighter, and everybody played Street Fighter back in those days, right? Like if you was into gaming or kind of into gaming, everybody played Street Fighter, right? But these guys were hardcore Street Fighter like junkies, and they started applying a lot of the things that they saw in video games to the internet. 'Cause prior to that, you're right, the internet was more or less trying to follow the same rules as print. And they're like, fuck this. We're going to actually apply video gaming terminology and interactions to the internet. And these guys, in my opinion, they revolutionized what the internet was to become. Like they took the internet from being just a bunch of pictures and some type here and whatever, and they gave it form. Like they actually started designing web pages to feel more like design, and even how interactive with like using Flash at the time. Like even though your interactions online was very interactive, they used stuff like friction and inertia and a lot of physics that you would normally see in games and 3D space to actually get you to engage with a web page. And in my opinion, those guys were some of the best designers at the time who was frontiering stuff. They wasn't even using Macs or PCs. They were using the I think it was called SGI machines. Those the silicone graphics machines. You remember those?
Yeah, I do.
Yeah, those things at the time was like $15,000 a machine, and these guys were using these laptops that you would use to design airplanes and space shuttles, right? The silicone graphics machines, and they was using that to code like new frontier online, and they completely broke a lot of rules. But to your point, they used the internet as a canvas to do something uniquely different.
So when did you feel like you took that transformation into using that as an inspirational point, jumping off point? How did you use the internet in those days?
Oh, yeah. That's 97, 98. At the time, I was working at Bell South. Bell South Advertising and Publishing, a.k.a. the Yellow Pages. More or less, I went through that whole apprenticeship program for the first 2 years from 95 to like 97. And in like 98, I started taking a big interest in learning how to design for the web. So me and a couple of my friends, one by the name of Quentin, my cousin Marquez, and a couple other guys, we just started trying to learn how to design for the web. And, Quentin eventually got a job at this company called OutWeb back in like 99. And I joined him, right? And we basically were some of the first designers in that company. And we would meet up with a bunch of other designers throughout, the city of Atlanta, and go to these, conferences and learn how to use the internet. Using Dreamweaver, using Flash, using Lingo, and all these different coding languages and just design tools to design web pages. I think back then we were just trying to figure it out, so there wasn't any kind of real standards, and we were just kind of coming up with our own standards. But yeah, it was fun. It was just like designing web pages for musicians, designing web pages for B2B businesses. And at the time, web pages, depending on where you worked at, if you design a website, people was paying $1 million for websites. Certain companies was paying literally $1 million to get a website done. And that was unheard of. Even my little crew of designers, we all used to kind of live together. We were paying for DSL back then for like $100 back then, right? And it wasn't even a third of the speed that you can get on the phone today, right? But it was faster than the internet back then. Even when we was able to play video through a Flash video player online was just huge. That was huge back then, right? And It was kind of groundbreaking. But a lot of people just wasn't into that kind of stuff. Like especially my print friends who decided to stay in print, and they thought that, what we was doing was just a fad, and turned out that was the future. And that was those days. It was just real innovative, real fun back then.
That's a fantastic transition. I want to just dive in just a little bit for the listeners are out there that don't know what the Yellow Pages are, right? Because we do have some young people. There was a directory of phone numbers and
businesses.
And businesses. And I remember it was because we use them all the time, but that there you could actually businesses could buy advertisements, and then it was a list of everybody who had a phone number in a city, like in a
Yeah.
particular uh, not zip code, because it was, but based, I think it was on the area code, right?
Area code, yeah. Yeah. It could be multiple area codes in one directory. Depends on how big that area they serve. But in like a place like Atlanta or even New York, yeah, all these yellow pages came out of the phone companies. You know, Ma Bell, which got broken up in the early 80s into like Pacific Bell, Bell South, with something that became like Verizon or whatever, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah, all those phone companies had their directories, yellow page directories. And to your point, they had all the data, they had all the numbers, they had literally where everybody was located, businesses and homes, and they didn't innovate. I mean, I remember working at Bell South at the time. It was called it used to be called Southern Bell, and it changed the name to Bell South. I remember a group of us was telling our managers, "Hey, it's this thing called Google that might actually you may want to look into it. It's allowing people to just to search for things," and they thought we was crazy. They thought we was just insane. Like, oh, that's a fad. It's gonna go away. This is our product. This big yellow book of directories. And sure enough, that book made a lot of money for them. But the problem with that book is somebody came along and took them right out. It wasn't really Google that took them out. It was Craigslist, right? Craigslist literally took out the yellow pages. And, you know, the idea of being able to search for a phone number or a business, like that was very foreign. But now that's commonplace. But yeah, back then doing directory design was huge. But those guys, it just goes to show you that when you don't reinvent yourself or disrupt your own, you know, business model, you can become obsolete really, really quick. And the yellow pages, yeah, it became really obsolete really quick in the early 2000s. But late 90s, they were still on top of the world, you know?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So let's fast forward a little bit. And you go from being, early days of the web. Talk to me about the journey from that to where you are today sitting at IBM.
Yeah. I would say that journey is definitely a journey of hills and valleys. You know, a lot of big ups and a lot of big downs. And the big down was the initial crashing of the .com era, right? How it just died. The bubble just burst around about 99, 2000. So that was a bubble bursting. But I really believe that the thing that saved the bubble bursting on the .com era, technically it was 9/11. 9/11, a lot of people say that it was the dying off of, it was the beginning of the end of like big advertising, because a lot of advertising agencies couldn't run ads for like almost a month right off 9/11. But the one thing that people did back then was starting to get online. Mind you that a lot of people was using AOL, which kind of kept you out of certain websites. It wasn't on the open web. But more and more people started getting online to either connect through chat rooms. I'm just going to say it. A lot of people was going online for porn. Porn kind of saved the .com era, to be honest with you. And then they started using the internet to more or less connect in a manner of like downloading music, right? So, after 9/11 really happened, man, people wanted to find, I guess, anything that brought some sense of joy. So, those things was that 9/11 led to that. So for me, after the .com era kind of burst and 9/11 happened, I had to kind of take a break from design because I couldn't find a job. The jobs was dried up. Basically, I poured coffee for 2 years at Starbucks, but I was still designing for different like marketing companies at the time, right? And I still hung on to my digital, mindset, because I just felt that was going to come back and it was going to come back big. So that said, I started going back to my roots of doing directory design for, some of these publications such as like Home Depot and their directory of like tools, or doing these big e-com, directories. But slowly enough, some of those things started kind of coming online in like the early 2000s. And a lot of ad agencies started seeing the potential of the internet. So people like Chris Porter-Bogolsky, even some of the big agencies like Ogilvy and maybe like JWT or whatever, they started using the internet now as a way to run campaigns. And that's when the microsite kind of took off then, right? So a bunch of microsites like was big in like the early 2000s. So at the time, I went from pouring coffee back to working at an agency called Bernard Hodis, recruitment ad agency, part of Omnicom. These guys basically did recruitment from everybody from the military to grocery stores. So I started designing interactive CDs and recruitment websites for those guys. I stayed there for 2 years. I eventually moved over to this agency called 22 Squared. We started designing a bunch of cool digital microsite experiences for people like Toyota, definitely like Publix, grocery stores, and even like Lincoln Financial and Buffalo Wild Wings, right? So did that for 2.5 years. And then all of a sudden I get an opportunity to move to New York because my friend Quentin, again, we kind of helping each other out. We would get each other's jobs. If I work somewhere, I get him a job. He works somewhere, he get me a job. But he decided to move to New York and work for this multicultural agency called Global Hue. At the time, they was building out their whole digital department, and I was one of the few people that stayed in digital. And me and this guy, we used to work at a bunch of digital spots, but he went back more to the traditional side. And they needed to build out a digital agency or a digital department within the agency. So I interviewed and I took the job in New York, they're based out of Detroit, but they had an office in New York. And I took the job and moved to New York, me and Nicole. And I stayed there for like 3 years, maybe 2 years. The next thing you know, I left Global Hue and ended up at Digitas, doing healthcare, digital work. And at some point I left there and, ironically, I ran into you, out in Jersey because I was freelancing at some small company out in Jersey, right? And next thing you know, we're like doing stuff together and I'm working back again at some different agencies and I land at this agency called Accenture, well, Acuity Group, who got acquired by Accenture. And then next thing you know, you're pulling my shoulder and tying my arm behind my back to come and work at IBM. So that's kind of the story, right? That's the story. That's kind of like a 15-year journey within me talking for these last couple of minutes. It's a lot of things that went on in between that, but that's more or less the milestones there, right? And it's been mostly a digital creative story,
One of the things you tapped into, I think is so important for so many of our listeners to understand is that everybody's trajectory isn't always a straight line. It isn't this straight ladder. Yeah. And, you touched on something I want to dive into. It's like that the highs are real high and the lows can be really low. I have experienced those lows. I'll never forget, living in Chicago during the dot-com bust. And, and there was this point where, I had incredible success in being a designer. And, the minute that the income gets shut off, I found myself being a cashier for a couple months at Bed Bath and Beyond to make sure that those bills were paid for my kiddos. Mm-hmm. And, I never looked at those. What's interesting as I look past that and go, wow, those were moments of character building that you would ask yourself during those periods, will I ever return to what I love?
Yeah.
But you did.
I guess I never stopped being that, right? It's one thing to return back to it professionally, but in my mind, I never stopped being a designer. I was like, okay, I'm still a designer. I'm still a creative. I'm just pouring coffee for right now, right? Or I'm just working these temp jobs, right? But in my mind, I never was not a creative, even though a lot of people probably know what that means, right? Especially in the Black community, we just, if you're creative, you're typically entertaining somebody. But like a commercial creative, like a lot of people just didn't know what that means. So, but as long as I knew what that means, and it didn't matter what other people didn't know, and I've never lost that passion to be that, regardless if I was making a Frappuccino or making a logo for somebody while I'm on my break from making frappuccinos, you know?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, you have this trajectory of this incredible career, worked for some of the largest agencies and consultancies of the world. When you look back, was there ever you look back and go, God, I'm really, really proud of this piece of work, or this was a point in time where I felt like maybe I was at my most creative, or I got through a period of my time where I was, I was, kind of emulating a certain kind of look or feel.
Mm-hmm. I'll give you three. One, when I was working at Uniwork Group, we worked on a campaign called Fight with Purpose for the United States Marine Corps. I shot these two Marines, one called Drexel King and the other one named Monica Lamise. Drexel's a black guy from Raleigh, North Carolina, and Monica's a Latinx woman based out of, I forgot the part of Arizona, Scottsdale, Arizona, right? And we highlighted the stories of who they were from their communities, because the Marines had never talked like that. The Marines always talking like core first, and core is a group. It's no individuality. It's no one story we're telling. But we decided from our insights that if we want to try to reach certain groups of people to join the core, you have to highlight these stories about their communities first, because that's what makes them. And yeah, we went and captured a bunch of beautiful imagery and video and made it a really cool digital experience on Marines.com that was all about their impact to their communities. And we didn't have them in their dress blues, their uniform. We had them in regular civilian clothes with, like a Marine t-shirt on or whatever. But we showed that their impact that they brought from their community, or what impact they gave back to their community. So I felt proud on that, right? Another one would be is some of the work that I've done with you, ironically. Like, it's 7 years from the time that we embarked on that beautiful journey with the wearable from Apple, Apple Watch project. And I must say, it's taken 6 years for a lot of those ideas to actually manifest. But we came up with a lot of beautiful thinking. And it was messy, but I don't get it twisted. It was a messy journey, but it was a fun journey. And I must say, I've been chasing that feeling even at IBM to this day. And I just feel like that'll never be there, because that's a whole nother level of thinking. And that was a different time too. It was also the Obama era too. So, it's just a fun era, but it was beautiful innovation that came out of that. And very, very cool thinking. So yeah, a lot of the ideas we came up with for the watch and for our client at the time, who knew that now that stuff is just commonplace now, right? Like, the idea of being able to pay for things with your phone, or send money from a wearable, or send money, to wherever, and use that to transact seamlessly, not on a computer, but on some type of wearable device. Like, who knew? Like, even the idea of unlocking a door to a bank with your phone or your watch, that was unheard of. Now you can do that, So that was fun. And the third one I would say is working on stuff with Spike Lee. Never in a million years thought I'd be working with that guy. And we connected basically online, right? We connected on social media. It's just me, putting out imagery around the unfortunate untimely death of Eric Garner. And Nicole reminded me that, my wife Nicole reminded me that I think I tagged him in it, and he just caught wind of it and said, "Hey, can I have permission to use this?" And I'm like, "Oh snap, this is Spike Lee." Like, I'm like, "Fuck yeah, you can use it. I'm gonna tell you no." And he basically, we basically built a relationship from him asking permission to repost the image on his Instagram account, which was the image of Eric Garner that I turned into a poster based off the images that I saw as a kid from the missing and child murders. That same look and feel, I brought that to that line of work called Suspicious Prisms. And yeah, that's how my relationship began with Spike, is just based off the feeling I had at the moment I wanted to express around, police brutality, using this type of like style of illustration with the portrait of Eric Garner's, high school prom picture, a graduation picture. So yeah, that was like my 3 moments, I would say, over the last 15 years or so of me doing something I think was pretty impactful.
You know, it's an interesting because so much of that work you were in the midst of creating when I think we first met. And I was just, for me, I learned so much from you, and the ability to bring emotion and tell a story with an image, right? And tell something deep, a deep story in those posterized images of people that had died. Um, and when I look back now at the body of work I look back, you talked about the Marines, you talked about the work that you and I collaborated on, really reinventing what it meant to be a bank in the world of wearables, and the work that you've been doing with Spike. Each one of them, you have expressed a new method of capturing really human stories. When I look at the Warriors Project piece that you did, something that is brought to light to me is that I'd never seen Latinx men and women, or Black men and women, lit. First of all, properly. Let me start there, because we need to get lit differently.
We do.
But those stories, their stories, and the impact they had on their community. And then I look at that thread and see, the work that we did in Apple, and so much of it I remember came from going to banks, in communities. And it was bringing that sense of community banking, what we would want in our own community banks, into a very large financial institution. And that same thread, right? You could just pull that thread all the way into the Spike Lee work that you've been doing over the years with him in creative direction for movie titles. It's like that. Do you ever feel like you understood what that thread was? Was it intentional?
I don't know if it's intentional, but I do understand that the thread is, and maybe this is a term, I don't know, I'm just going to throw it out there. I'm just going to call it societal design, right? It's one thing to say that, you have like industrial design, you have what they call business design, which is like, coming up with like design thinking methods to solve a business problem. But I do think overall design is meant to solve problems for humans. But if you're saying that, it's this subcategory of design called societal design, then maybe that's a category around specifically solving problems that's going to solve problems for massive amounts of people, as opposed to these groups of people, right? Like, designing tools that fix a bridge is a very specific design solution. But if you're now saying designing something that touches society across demographics, whether a certain ethnic group or a certain gender identity or a certain age or a certain creed or whatever, I think societal design is meant to touch humanity overall, as opposed to just looking at small sections of humanity. So I feel like a lot of the work that I've put out has more or less leaned into that. And, it wasn't by intent. It just happened that way. And I think now, reflecting back on it, maybe that's what it was all along. I just didn't know it.
Thank you so much for joining me on this journey today. I invite you to join us on the next episode as we discover the voices and magic makers changing the very shape of our future by design.